First order of business, we're going to review Black Op Radio's work, 50 Reasons for 50 Years. We're going to cover each and every one of them, starting right now with my co-host, Dr. James Fetzer. Can you handle the truth? I doubt it, but let's hit him with it anyway. Come in, Dr. Fetzer. Dr. James H. Fetzer, come in. Can you read me?
I can read you loud and clear.
All right, stand by. I'm going to beam me up.
Just a minute, Chief. Isn't this top security?
Yeah.
Well, shouldn't we activate the cone of silence?
The cone of silence?
Yes.
All right, Max. Hodgkins.
Yes, sir.
Activate the cone of silence.
The cone of silence?
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir? You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, my hand here. Okay.
What did you do in Russia?
Lee Oswald, as we know, was charged with the murder of President Kennedy, only to be gunned down himself some 36 hours later. The evidence against him would never have a chance to be tested in court, and a motive for the assassination of the president would never be positively established. When presenting the official narrative, which paints Lee Oswald as an erratic malcontent, prone to violent outbursts, and disillusioned with his apparent low status in life, the Warren Commission was admittedly unable to come up with any definitive conclusions regarding Oswald's psychology or motive. Colorful and deceptive language appears throughout the report's chapter on his background and motivation. It was all, in the Warren Commission's eyes, a confounding mystery. In 1975, while serving on a select committee on intelligence operations, Senator Richard Schweiker could say that the fingerprints of intelligence were everywhere in Oswald's history. The Warren Commission was apparently unaware of these ties. In trying to explain the strange details of Lee Oswald's life, the defection to Russia, events in New Orleans and Mexico City, the Warren Commission made up their own psychological profile of a loner and willfully avoided any complicating factors that would dispute their predetermined conclusion.
Here comes the man again.
I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president.
No, sir, I didn't. People
How'd you get the black eye?
Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man.
Come on, man. No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
So, who was Lee Oswald and what was his role in the Kennedy assassination? Military analyst Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty offers his view.
I have no difficulty in seeing Oswald through his brief career as a CIA man, from his Marine work to going to Russia, coming back to Dallas, where he met de Mohrenschildt and these other throwbacks to the White Russians. Why did that community pick him up if he had proclaimed himself a Marxist? Why did he work with a photography company that was doing highly classified Army photography work? How did he get into those things if he wasn't right in the middle of intelligence work? I have no problem, and I mentioned Atsugi. He wouldn't have been at Atsugi if he wasn't in this kind of work. With the assassination, I would say that his role, he probably didn't know this, was to provide for the mechanics, 2 men or 3 men, the positioning they needed for the little structural work they do before they fire their guns, like maybe the week before. The mechanics are not from this country, and they need somebody that can get them into the Daltex building, the depository building, up on a grassy knoll, or wherever they were. You know, they can't do that by themselves. They can't ask a policeman for the help. And that man is going to be removed. That's where the Patsy comes in. This is an old thing. King Henry II removed the cardinal, you know, back in the 12th century. And he never told anybody to do it. The knights did it because they knew King Henry would smile if the cardinal was gone. Nobody said shoot him.
Episode 1 is simply excellent. That Leno Sanik's introduction is particularly appropriate. It raises a lot of questions, including, for example, the images we see only briefly from Mexico City, which we will discuss in subsequent episodes. I do agree with Fletcher Prouty that Lee was recruited by the Office of Naval Intelligence while he was a recruit in San Diego, that he received foreign language training in 1958 before his pseudo-defection to the Soviet Union on behalf of the CIA, and that after he returned to the United States, he was working for American intel agencies, including as an informant for the FBI, right up to the time of the assassination. So I think it's a very, very good introduction.
All right, well, let's go on to number 2.
In this week's episode, author John Armstrong examines the records and evidence regarding Lee Oswald that the Warren Commission had to cover up. The question remains, was he impersonated, or were there two Oswalds?
My name is John Armstrong, and I'm the author of the book Harvey and Lee. There are many mysteries surrounding the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin. How does a high school dropout teach himself Russian, a very difficult language? How does a defector who pledged to reveal secrets while in Russia return to the United States under such little suspicion? Why do his activities coincide with intelligence activities so frequently? Personal recollections combined with paper trails have shown Oswald repeatedly in 2 separate locations at the same time. In 1953, Oswald is simultaneously in New York City and North Dakota. In 1954, at the same time, he is in New Orleans and Fort Worth. In 1957 and 1958, he's working at a dental laboratory in New Orleans while also serving with the Marines in Japan. J. Edgar Hoover knew of the two Oswalds long before the assassination. Memos referring to two Oswalds crossed his desk in 1960 and again in 1961. These memos note that Oswald was both in Russia and working with Cuban exiles in Louisiana and Florida. In the aftermath of the assassination, the FBI gathered school and employment records related to both Oswalds. A Warren Commission memorandum in April 1964 discussed a need to sanitize conflicting information. Specifically, the memo reads, "There are details which will require material alteration and in some cases omission. Anomalies with some of Oswald's employment records and school records appear to be the result of alteration or forgery by the FBI. Other records have disappeared entirely."
In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, the FBI seized employment and school records from locations such as Pfister Dental Laboratories in New Orleans and Stripling High School in Fort Worth, Texas, while denying there was any reason to do so. In 1964, Warren Commission member Richard Russell conducted a private investigation into several aspects of the case. Army intelligence officer Philip Corso, using contacts within the government, reported to Russell that there were indeed 2 different men using Oswald's passport, and this was connected to a false defector program.
Stay tuned for the next installment as we expose week after week 50 lies the Warren Commission would like you to believe.
Well, this is one of the most fascinating and challenging aspects of JFK research, where Armstrong has amassed a huge documentary record in his enormous book, which I have lying on the floor beside me. But where I have remained skeptical for the following reason: it seems to me if you're going to establish the existence of 2 different persons, to whom he refers as Harvey and Lee, then you actually have to establish the existence of at least 3. Namely, the Lee Oswald who was murdered by Jack Ruby in Dallas, who appears to have been working for the CIA, as Fletcher Prouty observed. His false persona created by the agency to enable him to return to civilian life. And then the third individual, which Armstrong and others contend is actually a second genuine bona fide person. So that, in my opinion, in order to establish the existence of 2 Oswalds, you'd actually have to establish the existence of 3. My opinion is that the weight of the evidence suggests that Armstrong mistook the false persona created by the CIA to enable Lee Harvey Oswald to return to civilian life after having served his government so well for the existence of a second Oswald. My conclusion, therefore, is not proven.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Judy Baker would be a reliable source of some of this information?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, let's beam her up now.
Okay.
Judith, tell me about that. There were actually two different Oswalds, one called Harvey, one called Lee. Are you impressed by that argument?
Not very much, since I knew the real Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, how in the world can you have two Marguerites? You're supposed to have the entire Moret family, including all the cousins, have to know both Lee and Harvey. How can you have a Harvey being driven to Exchange Place by Myra DeRue saying, this is Harvey and I'm taking to Exchange Place, and then, according to this one book, a couple months later, Lee moves into the same apartment. Come on, Exchange Place. There is no, yes, it's right in the Armstrong book.
Now, are you impressed by the claim that they had different eye color?
Of course not, because we're talking about the fact that Lee Oswald had an unusual pair of eyes, to the point that when Marina worried, because when a body drains of blood, by the way, I was trained medically, a lot of the tissues can collapse and they will look a little different. She actually opened the eye to see if the eye color was the same, and she was satisfied that it really was Lee that was dead when she saw him on the autopsy table.
Very interesting.
And, so, yes, and he did. He had unusual eyes. He had a ring of brown, but most of his eye was like blue-gray. In a different light, it would even look like they were blue.
So some of the claims of the Lee and Harvey having different color eyes appear to have resulted from the circumstances under which they were being observed.
And I've noticed also they've done a lot of changing of the photos. For example, when you see television footage of Lee Oswald, the original photos that were live footage, you don't see Lee Oswald smiling or making what's called this smirk. But in the newspaper ones, here it is, you've got these little black lines on. If you blow it up, you can see that they make him look like he's smiling.
So you're telling me about some of the classic, allegedly historic photographs that a smirk has been imposed on the face of Lee Oswald.
Yeah, he didn't smile like that.
Wow, thank you so much, Judith. Is it okay that we beam you up anytime we need you?
Yes.
Awesome. Hang tight, I'm going to beam you out right now. All right, Professor Fetzer, how about the false defector program and Oswald's involvement? This is Bill Simpich.
1959. Lee Oswald mysteriously gets a dependency discharge from the Marines, supposedly to look after an ailing mother. A week later, he's on a freighter heading to the Soviet Union. This is the time period that saw a flurry of activity from U.S. intelligence agencies in the false defector program. Researcher Bill Simpich explains.
Oswald, he gets himself out of the service in the summer of '59 by saying, I gotta take care of my mama out in Texas. A candy box fell on her nose. She's been terribly injured. When he gets to Texas, he doesn't stay there more than 72 hours. He's running off to New Orleans. And within a couple days, he gets on a freighter. Nobody takes a freighter. Webster is another American. During this era, there's about 20 Americans who were living in the Soviet Union. Webster had spent a few months there. He was part of the whole operation setting up the American exhibition in Moscow in 1959. It's the site where Nixon and Khrushchev had their kitchen debate. While that exhibition was being broken down, early September or so, Webster disappears. And Webster is a plastics technician. All of a sudden, just poof, vanishes. And that period, when they don't know where Webster is precisely when Oswald comes into play. They finally find out early October where Webster is. And now Webster has actually decided to defect. Oswald gets off at like the second stop, and he hops his way over to Helsinki in a matter of days. He gets across the border almost instantly. Now he's in the Soviet Union. Days before, he was like drifting in a freighter, putting his way through the North Atlantic. When Oswald actually got to the Soviet Union, he started making all these threats to reveal to the Soviets all that he knew about Navy radar installations in the Pacific. He never quite said the word U2. He kind of tap danced around that. When he made those kind of threats, he got the attention of people at the embassy. And I'm talking about the American embassy in Moscow. Richard Snyder was the guy who held the fort there as a consul, and he was the guy who Oswald went to when he got into the Soviet Union saying, I'm going to defect to the Russians, and I want to renounce my citizenship. Please let me renounce my citizenship. And Snyder comes back at him and says, well, actually, we don't take renunciations on Saturday. You come back on Monday, and Oswald never came back. Since all these embassies were bugged, and the American one was certainly no exception, the question has to be asked, was he really saying this for the Russians' benefit? Red Cap was a program focused on dealing with Soviet counterintelligence, using counterintelligence against the Soviets. Red Skin was a program about trying to get people inside red countries, usually people like travelers or tourists. In a lot of documents, Oswald is labeled as a tourist. It makes you wonder, well, maybe he got into the Red Skin program. They would always be looking for ways to get Soviets to defect in place so they could be spies for the United States, or failing that, getting a United States citizen into the Soviet Union using their observations, even as mundane as where the telephone poles and fire hydrants were. Oswald could have been either one of those things or none. We do know that the Red Cap program kicked into gear just about a month before he went out there. I think, given the strong physical resemblance the two guys had, that using Oswald was a way to get inside the Soviets' head and literally see how they responded to him. When the Warren Commission gets a hold of these documents from both Snyder and from the Navy and these Washington Post articles that Johnson's written about Oswald back in 1959, they keep whiting out somebody's name. They're not whiting out Mr. Oswald's name, they're whiting out the name of Robert Webster.
Oswald's return to the U.S. was financed by a State Department loan. A debriefing on his arrival was routine, but the CIA denied for years that one had even taken place. On his return, Robert Webster was debriefed over several weeks. Oswald's debriefing only took 1 day, even though he had offered classified information to the Soviets. The State Department loaned him more money to settle in Dallas.
All right, Dr. Fetzer. Bill Simpich, Oswald in the USSR.
I think this is an excellent, even extraordinary episode, and that it is very informative about an obscure aspect of the entire case, his travel to Finland and entry into the Soviet Union. The photographs, by the way, to me, substantially reinforce the impression that this was the same person in the Soviet Union as the person who was shot, who was arrested in Dallas and shot by Jack Ruby. So I found that particularly valuable. And I think that, this is showing one of Leno Sanik's strengths, that he's covering the entire case in such a comprehensive way. I like this episode very much.
You're listening to Patriot Radio New Orleans Maiden Voyage with Dr. James Fetzer and Gary King. Stay tuned. We're going to have episode 4 and 5 before we move on to news you can use. Stay tuned. Wait, hold on. Don't you think we should use the cone of silence?
The cone of silence, Gary, really.
It's the only place left that the NSA can't hear you.
Hodgkins.
Yes, sir.
Lower the cone of silence.
Were CIA contract pilot David Ferry and Clay Shaw. Not least, Oswald was observed by, among others, bar owner Orestes Pena, who saw Oswald in the frequent company of officers attached to U.S. Customs. That the Pena interview with the Church Committee remains suppressed is testament to the explosive nature of any exposure of Oswald's intelligence connections. In his capacity as a plant in a fake Fair Play for Cuba committee, Oswald functioned on behalf of CIA, the FBI, and U.S. Customs simultaneously. His public role rendered him the perfect patsy for the assassination planners who killed John F. Kennedy. Shortly after Warren de Bruij's told anti-Castro activist Carlos Bringuier, "I can infiltrate your organization and find out what you're doing here anytime." Oswald first appeared at Bringuier's New Orleans store. Bringuier's contact with Oswald in New Orleans belongs to Phillips' strategy of manipulation of the young members of the DRE into a connection with the agency's asset, Oswald. In the summer of 1963, a clearly staged incident, Carlos Bringuier expressed outrage, anger, and surprise at discovering that Lee Oswald, who had volunteered for the anti-Castro cause, was handing out Fair Play for Cuba leaflets on Canal Street. A scuffle ensued, as intended, creating a public identity for Oswald as a Fidel Castro supporter. Oswald wrote about the incident in a letter to V.T. Lee of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, postmarked 5 days before his confrontation with Bringuier. The event had yet to occur. At the same time that Oswald was handing out pro-Castro leaflets and presenting himself as a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he was observed frequently at the office of CIA asset and former FBI special agent in charge in Chicago, Guy Bannister. Oswald even had Bannister's address, 544 Camp Street, stamped on some of the leaflets. It was a careless operation, indicative of the confidence with which CIA assumed it could control the media.
Well, Gary, this is the most familiar and least interesting aspect of Lee Oswald's life in New Orleans. For much more fascinating material, you want to go to Me and Lee by Judith Very Baker, which explains how she and David Ferry and Dr. Mary Sherman, with Lee's assistance, were working on the development of a rapid-acting cancer that could possibly be used against Fidel Castro, but actually appears to be used against Jack Ruby, or the love affair segment of Nigel Turner, which is all about Judith's experience with Lee in New Orleans, or alternatively, Ed Haslam's book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. All of those are far more interesting and informative about what happened with Lee Oswald in New Orleans.
Mexico City, fall 1963. The Warren Commission claimed that Lee Oswald visited the Cuban consulate and the Russian embassy in an attempt to secure a visa to visit Cuba. But where's the evidence? No photos, no audio recordings, no positive identification. Researcher John Armstrong explains.
My name is John Armstrong, and I'm the author of the book Harvey and Lee. There is no definitive proof that Lee Harvey Oswald went to Mexico City. I believe the whole thing was staged. The CIA had the Cuban embassy phone conversations taped in 10 different places. They had the Russians' phone conversations taped. There was a lot of discussion, especially the HSCA, about the cameras that were all around the Cuban embassy and the Russian embassy. These were called pulse star cameras. And the telephoto lens was focused on the entry door to the Russian and or Cuban consulates. Not one camera. There were 2 at the Cuban consulate, and I think there were 3 at the Russian embassy. Strangely enough, the CIA, through the testimony of David Atlee Phillips, the cameras were not working on the days that Oswald visited the Cuban consulate or the Russian embassy. The House Select Committee did subsequent investigations and found that they were working, and Phillips was lying. A short man with blonde hair showed up at the Cuban consulate and identified himself as Oswald. Yet there are no CIA photographs or tape recordings that identify this man. None of the consulate employees or the 2 CIA assets inside the Cuban compound identified the man as Lee Harvey Oswald. Look at the description of the man who Sylvia Duran said entered the Cuban consulate. She described him as short, blonde, unelegantly dressed, and his face turned red when he got frustrated. Members of the House Select Committee talked personally with Fidel Castro. Castro's people gave the House Select Committee photographs that they had taken of the person who identified himself as Oswald at the Cuban consulate in 1963. When Sylvia Duran suggested Oswald talk to him about getting a visa, Oswald, he calls the Soviet embassy from Sylvia Duran's office. He made a call, talked in very, very broken Russian, and that tape recording was recorded by the CIA, and what we have now is a person who appears to be somewhat desperate to get a visa to go back to Cuba. The tape recording of Oswald's voice, which was clearly not Oswald. The FBI heard it. They were of the opinion that this is not Lee Harvey Oswald's voice. And then the tape disappeared or was erased. The conversation between Hoover and President Johnson that occurred at 10:01 a.m. on November 23rd, the day following the assassination, as the two men discussed Oswald's visits to Mexico City. We have up here the tape and the photograph of the man who was at the Soviet embassy using Oswald's name. In other words, it appears that a second person who was at the Soviet embassy down there. CIA officers lied, and we now know they fabricated documents and photographs in an attempt to create the illusion that Oswald was in Mexico City. The Warren Commission had very little documentation that placed Oswald in Mexico City, but had reports from credible eyewitnesses that placed him in Dallas at the same time. The Commission knew that photographs and a tape recording showed that someone impersonated Oswald in Mexico City, but they kept that information from the public because it strongly suggested a conspiracy.
The CIA summarized Sylvia Duran's statements for the Warren Commission, removing the description of a short, blonde Oswald. The Warren Commission was not the least bit suspicious that all the CIA's photo and audio surveillance allegedly either failed or was hastily erased against proper procedure. For the record, despite multiple opportunities over several days, the CIA could not produce any hard evidence of Oswald's presence in Mexico City and could not clarify why the transcripts of his visits appeared manipulated.
I have had conversations with a woman who grew up with members of a Toronto crime family that appear to involve serial killers, and she has told me that second, the larger, bulkier individual is actually a person by the name of Walter Tabinski. I haven't talked about this generally because I've been unable to find an independent photograph of Walter Tabinski to confirm it. But you can find a number of my interviews with her on Veterans Today in an article entitled Bank Robbers and Serial Killers, where everything she tells me is deeply disturbing. And I do think that this is an unexplored area of JFK research, because if what she has to say is even partially correct, it transforms our understanding of some significant aspects of the assassination. I like to say that J. Edgar sent a memorandum to his agents in charge stating that someone was in Mexico City impersonating Lee Oswald. In this instance, I think that John Armstrong understates the case, because in my opinion, anyone who was aware of that memorandum, that somebody had been impersonating Lee Oswald in Mexico City. Indeed, it appears two different persons in all probability. They would know that this was a conspiracy setting him up as a patsy for the death of JFK.
You're absolutely right. One of the most fascinating things about the case is there is room for further investigation. All right, Dr. Fetzer, let's go on to the next one.
In this episode, we discuss Sylvia Odio, a witness the Warren Commission had to discredit. A cover-up surrounded her story, which had Lee Oswald in Dallas the same time the Warren Commission had him in Mexico City. Author Jim DiEugenio explains.
This is Jim DiEugenio. In late September of 1963, two Cuban men showed up at Sylvia Odio's door in her apartment in the Dallas area, and there was one Caucasian man. The two Cuban men introduced themselves as Angelo and Leopoldo. They introduced their Caucasian friend as Leon Oswald. They were there because she was part of a Cuban group called Jure, and they said that they were ostensibly there to solicit funds for the anti-Castro Cuban cause. She talked to them for several minutes. Her sister was also there, and she saw them also. And then finally, she decided that she wasn't going to give them information about how to solicit funds because she didn't think they were familiar enough with the Jure cause.
And now we find that the prime suspect in the case, and he is only that at the moment, has an identity of association with extreme left-wing groups. This is Lee Oswald, 24-year-old former Marine, who is being questioned about.
On the day of the Kennedy assassination, when she saw Oswald's photograph on TV, she fainted because she recognized that the Caucasian man called Leon was Lee Harvey Oswald. This was hit home to her because after the visit, one of the Cubans named Leopoldo called her up a day or so later and asked her what she thought of Leon Oswald. Described him as a former Marine who had come from New Orleans. He was an expert shot. He was a little bit crazy. And he thought that they should have done away with President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, and that it would be easy to do so. What makes Odio such a good witness is she communicated with more than one person about this incident before the assassination. She sent a letter to her father about the incident because the two men said they knew her father. And she talked to her psychiatrist about it. And she talked to a friend about it there in Dallas, Fort Worth. When she fainted, she actually went to the hospital. Her sister, who was there that night, visited her, and they both decided that that had been the man, that Oswald had been the man who they saw that night. What happened, of course, after this is there began to be a cover-up by both the FBI and the Warren Commission about this particular incident. And the Warren Commission ended up saying that they didn't believe Odio, even though he is a terrifically credible witness. In Sylvia Marr's book, called Accessories After the Fact, she writes a whole chapter on the Odio incident, and she titles it The Proof of the Plot. And it is very, very convincing, both her as a witness and the fact that it certainly does appear that approximately 7 weeks in advance of the assassination, somebody was setting up Oswald to take the fall for the Kennedy assassination.
The FBI claimed William Seymour was actually Leon Oswald, even as he denied it and as the FBI was in possession of work records showing Seymour in Florida in September 1963. The Warren Commission had already placed Oswald on a bus to Mexico at the same time the Sylvia Odio incident occurred.
All right, Dr. Fesser, we'll pick this up next week with 5 more episodes. All right, so let's go ahead and polish it off with the Sylvia Odio incident.
Well, it's a very obvious indication that Oswald was being framed. I'm not convinced it actually was Lee, but may have been someone who looked very much like him, as is reportedly the case with his brother Robert. But it's obvious from this why the Warren Commission and the FBI wanted to suppress it, because it shows him in collusion or collaborating with others. I mean, he's there speaking to her with 2 other persons. Very difficult under those circumstances to deny that he had associates, and therefore that a conspiracy was highly probable. It's among the few instances in which I tend to disagree with Judith, who believes that Lee actually was in Mexico City, because, as I've already explained, neither of the individuals who claim to have been Lee Oswald actually was Lee Oswald there, which is such powerful proof all by itself of the existence of a conspiracy to frame him.
Great observation. Be sure to tune in next week. We will have 5 more episodes. We are critical thinkers, and we will continue the investigation of Jim Garrison. We are on the trail of the assassins. You're listening to Patriot Radio New Orleans with Gary King and Dr. James Fetzer. Thank you so much for being on board of our maiden voyage of alternative media. So, all right, Dr. Fetzer, take us out with the elementary question of the week, followed by the advanced question of the week.
Victory.
Mrs. Evelyn Cantrell from Grand Isle, Louisiana writes, my sister and I had an argument the other day. She completely insists it was the mafia. I knew my dear sister was incorrect, but was at a loss to explain to her why. Can you help me with my argument? I'll be meeting her next Sunday.
Some of the most basics about the assassination include that there were more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit. The Mafia could not have controlled that. And while I believe the Mafia was involved in the assassination, certainly they sponsored it along with a good number of other groups, including the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, the anti-Castro Cubans, the Eastern Establishment in relation to the Fed, the Texas oil men in Israel. It's obvious that the Mafia could not have altered X-rays at Bethesda Naval Hospital under the control of officers of the U.S. Navy, agents of the Secret Service, or the President's personal physician. The Mafia could not have substituted someone else's brain for the brain of JFK. The Mafia could not have got its hands on the Zapruder film to alter it. The Mafia had a role, but the idea that the Mafia was responsible for the crime is a myth. It's a piece of mythology perpetrated especially by Robert Blakey, who was responsible for conducting the HSCA investigation, but it was in fact a red herring. To pursue that is to lead you away from the truth.
Exactly.
As much as to presume that Lee Oswald was the lone demented shooter.
All right, Dr. Fesser, take us out. This is a weekly series, The State of the Evidence. We continue the Jim Garrison investigation. What evidence do we have that Harry Weatherford was one of the shooters on the record building?
Well, the first hit on JFK was fired from the top of the county records building, as Robert Groden has observed, although Sheriff Bill Decker, who ran the county with an iron hand, declared that the security for the presidential ended at Houston and Elm. He stationed Deputy Sheriff Harry Weatherford to take up a position on top of the county records building. Researcher Penn Jones realized that Weatherford was a crack shot and confirmed his location. Weatherford was once asked whether he'd shot JFK and replied, "You little son of a bitch, I shoot lots of people." Penn Jones also wrote that a custom-made silencer for the rifle had been delivered to Weatherford a few weeks before the assassination. Richard E. Sprague, who did a brilliant analysis of the shooting sequence, on which I have added some refinements, had a shot from the top of the county records building, which is the shot that hit JFK in the back, and where Jim Mars and I both agree that this shot was made by Harry Weatherford using a larger caliber weapon, probably a 30-06, using a plastic collar known as a sabot, S-A-B-O-T, to fire a Mannlicher Carcano, which may well have been intended to hit JFK in the head, but because of the properties of the round in the shooting situation, actually hit him 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column, a shallow shot that only went in about as far as the second knuckle on your little finger at a downward angle. So there's really quite a convergence of evidence and opinion among students of JFK that Harry Weatherford fired that shot from the top of the county records building.
And that's where it stands right now. And if anyone has any other information, they're welcome to bring it forward. But that's where it stands at this moment. All right, Dr. Fetzer, great show, and can't wait for next week.
My pleasure, Gary. I look forward to it, too.